Hi, Aztecs. Welcome to Module 2B, Chapter 3, The Cells, Part 1. So in Part 1, we're going to talk about the plasma membrane, aka the cell membrane, aka the phospholipid bilayer. There's probably some more AKAs that we will perchance get to know. But yeah, this is a cell, and this is where it all happens. First living thing on Earth was a living cell, and then the cells started to connect to each other, and they formed tissues. And how many billions of years later, Homo sapiens. So cells are pretty cool. I bet that a lot of you can already name many parts of the cell on this diagram. So for example, this big purple thing that's got kind of a cut here and a cut here. If you said the nucleus, you would be right. Oh, I bet some of you guys know this one. This orange thing. If you said the mitochondria, you would be right. This blue stuff, if you said the endoplasmic reticulum, you would be right. And this green stuff, probably, if you guys took high school biology, the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi complex, whatever you like to call it. But this is your new best friend, because I think we have 5 or 6 videos in for Chapter 3, the cells. So I found this online. It says, whenever you feel sad, just remember that there are billions of cells in your body, and all they care about is you. Well, that's completely false, because most of those cells are bacterial cells, and I guess they do care about you, because if they killed you, then they wouldn't have a host to live on anymore. So maybe it's a little bit true. The cell theory. So there's lots of theories out there. There's the theory of gravity. There's the theory of evolution. There's the germ theory that says that germs cause disease. Well, this is one of the major theories from the 20th century. The cell theory. Basically, it says its general concept is that all living things are made of cells. Therefore, cells are the structural units of all living things. This means that cells are the smallest unit of life that can survive and reproduce on their own. So that means there's single-celled creatures out there in the world, and they can live, they survive, they reproduce on their own as single cells. And a lot of those are protozoa. So if you take micro, you can learn all about those. The activity of an organ, number 2, 4 concepts. The activity of an organism depends on the collective activities of all of its cells. So that means the activity of you're an organism, depends on the collective activity of all of its cells. So the collective activity of the heart cells work as a pump. The collective activity of the liver cells work to detoxify toxins that get in your body. And then the third concept of the cell theory is, according to this principle of complementarity, the biochemical function of a cell is dictated by the structure of the cell. And all that means is structure complements function, function complements the structure of the cells. So for example, heart cells, they can contract. So their structure, it's their structure, and we'll talk about this later in the class, but it's their cellular structure that allows them to shorten and contract. And that allows the function of the heart, so all the cells contracting together, allows the function of the heart, which is to pump blood. And then the fourth concept of cell theory is that the continuity or the continuation of life has a cellular basis. So cells reproduce. Eukaryotic cells. So there's eukaryotic cells. Those are our cells. We are eukaryotes because we have eukaryotic cells. And then bacteria are prokaryotes because their cells are prokaryotic cells. If you are a eukaryotic cells, that means you have a nucleus. If you are a prokaryotic cells, a cell, that means you have no nucleus. So you probably know there's DNA in the nucleus. Just because bacteria have no nucleus does not mean that they have no DNA, because they do. Bacteria do have DNA. It's just not in a nucleus in their cytoplasm. Cells are composed of chone, the atoms, C, H, O, and N. And you guys probably know what those are: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And so in this cartoon, it shows this purple thing is the nucleus. Everything inside, well, this is the plasma membrane. Okay, so it's cut here. So they cut the plasma membrane so you can see inside. So all of this, everything that surrounds the cell is the plasma membrane. And then everything inside the plasma membrane is the cytoplasm. So all of this inside the cell is the cytoplasm, and then structures like the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi all live within the cytoplasm. In general, a cell has three major regions. So now this is where you really have to read these words closely, because there's three major regions. That's the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the plasma membrane. But then there's many structures within those regions. So within the region of the cytoplasm, you have the mitochondria and the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi, for example. Within the region called the nucleus, you have DNA. Human body has between 50 and 100 trillion cells, and many of those cells are bacterial cells. All right, plasma membrane. This is a review. This cartoon should be a review for you, because we talked about this phospholipid when we talked about the three major macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or fats. So this is really important to understand the way this phospholipid molecule is built, because phospholipids make up the plasma membrane, and the phospholipids form this phospholipid bilayer. So bi is 2. That means there's a layer of phospholipids on the top and a layer of phospholipids on the bottom. And it's the way it forms, you have to understand its chemistry to understand how this phospholipid bilayer that makes up the plasma membrane is constructed. So here's the cartoon of the phospholipid molecule, specifically this phosphatidylcholine. And you have a polar head. So this region here, this is a polar head, and then you have a non-polar tail. So hopefully you remember from the previous videos on polarity, a polar molecule has a negative pole and a positive pole. A non-polar molecule, or in this case a tail, does not have a negative or a positive pole on it. And then the glycerol backbone here, they show as neither polar nor non-polar. So anyway, let's look at the phosphorus-containing polar head group. Why is it polar? I hope you remember that a polar molecule is polar because there are some atoms in the molecule, like oxygen, that are negative, that are electron hogs. So even though they're participating in a bond with another atom, they tend to hog the electron, so they become partially negative. And then other molecules that other atoms that these electron hogging oxygen atoms are participating with, they tend to be partially positive. So that's the polar head. And if you are a polar molecule, excuse me, that means you can form hydrogen bonds with the water molecule. So remember, the water molecule is H2O. H2O, and water is a polar molecule. So the positive pole is where the hydrogens are, and the negative pole is where the oxygen is. This is a polar molecule. This is really important. Like, if you don't dig this right now, you will have a really hard time with 202, 205, 218, whatever other science classes you take. It will be really difficult for you to understand many concepts if you don't get this right now. So water is a polar molecule. There is a polar head on the phospholipid molecule that makes up the phospholipid bilayer of the plasma membrane. That means that this polar head will form hydrogen bonds with water. That means the polar head of the phospholipid molecule will want to be in a watery environment. Now, everything I just said about the polar head is the opposite for the nonpolar tail. So the nonpolar tails, they don't like water. The polar head likes water. The nonpolar tails do not like water. They shy away from water. And this is going to be important in understanding how they form the phospholipid bilayer. So this is a schematic phospholipid. This is the polar head. These are the nonpolar tails. So remember, the polar head likes water. The nonpolar tails do not like water. So the plasma membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. It contains two fatty acid chains. And the phosphorus head has an electrical charge, and we said this, that the phosphorus containing head reacts with water, and it also, because it's polar, the positive or the negative polarity of the phosphorus containing head group will react with positive ions, because opposites attract, right? Negative attracts positive. And then we said this, the fatty acid tails are nonpolar, they don't react with water. And the phospholipid forms a bilayer to form the cell membrane. Okay, here's a good cartoon of the phospholipid bilayer. So start up here, here's our cell, here's the plasma membrane, and then this is what it looks like molecularly. So you can see that these nonpolar tails that don't like water, they're in the middle where there is no water. And then the polar heads are out here on the outside of the bilayer, and they like water. So out here in the blue, this is the extracellular fluid, or the ECF, and it's a fluid and it's water, and these polar heads like it. This is inside the cell, the intracellular fluid, and it's mostly made of water. And here's the polar heads, and they like it because it's water, so they can form hydrogen bonds and things with water. And then the tails are hiding inside the phospholipid bilayer here, away from water. So that's why the phospholipid bilayer forms the way that it does, is the polar heads go toward the water and the fatty acid tails go away from the water. And that's the water in the ECF and the ICF. Okay, and then it tells you up here the extracellular fluid is a watery environment. The ICF in here, the cytoplasm, is a watery environment. And then you have all these other molecules stuck in the plasma membrane, and that's why they call it the fluid mosaic model. So it looks like these molecules that are in the phospholipid bilayer are stuck there, but they're actually fluid. They can actually float around in this phospholipid bilayer. And some of the things shown here, so this guy would be a glycoprotein stuck in the phospholipid bilayer, and these green things would be the glyco part, so they'd be like a sugar, and then this purple thing would be the protein part. And then here's some more sugar groups. These little yellow molecules are cholesterol that help make up the phospholipid bilayer, and these are just channel proteins. Well, this is a channel protein stuck in the phospholipid bilayer. Here's another protein, and what else they got? Oh, that looks like that's it. Oh, it just shows here, here's the filaments of the cytoskeleton. So like you have a skeleton, your cell has a skeleton. That's called a cytoskeleton. So let's look at the bullets. The phospholipids in the cell membrane, that's these guys. They form a bilayer, so here's one layer. Here's the second layer that makes up the bilayer. This bilayer is largely impermeable to water-soluble molecules. So if you are a water-soluble molecule out here, let's say, you dissolve in water, you're fine with reacting with these polar head groups, but because you are a water-soluble molecule, that means you must be polar, and it's going to be really hard for you to get through this non-polar area of the phospholipid bilayer. So one way you can get from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, you could use one of these channels. But the point is, if you are a big, like let's say negatively charged molecule out here, you are water soluble, because if you have a negative charge here, you will be soluble in water. You can't go through the phospholipid bilayer to get from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, but you could go through a channel. Phospholipid bilayer separates the ICF from the ECF, and the plasma membrane is made of phospholipids, glycolipids, cholesterol, proteins, glycoproteins, and sugars, and other things too, but those are the major things that the phospholipid bilayer is made of. The plasma membrane, made of a phospholipid bilayer, acts as a site of cell-to-cell recognition. So if this whole thing, this whole cartoon is one cell, it's cut, you're looking inside the cell. If this cell wants to recognize another cell, it can use proteins in its plasma membrane to recognize other cells. The plasma membrane has this property of selective permeability. That means the plasma membrane is selective to who it lets in to the ICF. But gases, some small gases, water molecules can pass through this plasma membrane, but most of the time the plasma membrane is selective as to who it lets in. Plasma membrane encloses the cell contents, that'd be like the Golgi and the nucleus, etc., such that water in the body, your whole body, is divided into separate compartments. The intracellular fluid, that's the fluid inside all the cells of your body, and the extracellular fluid, that's all the fluid in your body that's outside of cells. Okay, so the fluid mosaic model, here's our phospholipid bilayer. So this would be, well, this says the cytosol, so this would be flipped from the cartoon we looked at earlier. So this would be inside of the cell with the intracellular fluid. And then this would be the extracellular fluid, which is outside of the cell. And then here's our phospholipid bilayer. So the polar heads are here, and the nonpolar tails are here. And then there are these things in your cell membranes called lipid rafts. Lipid rafts. And they're just lipid domains or lipid areas. And they're present in the external leaflet or the outer membrane of the plasma membrane. So we didn't talk about this yet, but if this is the ICF here, then this whole phospholipid layer would be the inner leaflet of the phospholipid bilayer, and this would be the outer or external leaflet of the phospholipid bilayer. And then, so these lipid rafts are out here. They are attached to the external leaflet of the outer membrane. Lipid rafts are platforms for receptors and regulatory molecules for signal transduction. So that means all these things out here that are in the lipid raft. So for example, this thing, a GPI anchored protein, that can be a receptor that will bind to some molecule out here and send a signal to the inside of the cell. All right, other things in the plasma membrane are these structures called glycocalyces. So the glycocalyx, singular, binds cells together, and the glycocalyx is formed by glycolipids and glycoproteins. So all these guys here, here's a glycoprotein, here's a glycolipid. So this kind of area called the glycocalyx is formed by these lipids and proteins and carbohydrates that are sticky, and they're just superficial to the phospholipid bilayer. Some functions of the glycocalyx include protection. They help with immunity to infection. They act in defense against cancer, transplant compatibility, cell adhesion, that's where cells can stick to each other. The glycocalyx aids in fertilization. For example, enables the sperm to recognize and bind to the egg in the fallopian tube. And it's really important, the glycocalyx is really important in embryonic development. So when you're a little embryo and your heart cells need to know where to go to form a heart, they use the glycocalyx to do that. All right, this is just a quick overview of fluids. So when we talked about this earlier in previous videos, but a solution is a homogeneous mixture of two or more components. The solvent, which is like water, and the solute, the thing that dissolves in water. And then this cartoon is just showing taking some salt, putting it in some water, stir it up, and it dissolves. So you have solvent and solute. It's an important concept. The intracellular fluid, which would be here, this would be the ICF, is a cytosolic solution. So gases, nutrients like carbohydrates, and salts are all dissolved in water in the ICF. And then there's another fluid called the interstitial fluid. That's the solution outside of the cell. So this gets a little tricky because I didn't tell you this, but the extracellular fluid is broken down into two components, the interstitial fluid and everything that's the interstitial fluid is everything that's all the fluid that's outside of the cell but not in a blood vessel. So the ECF is composed of blood in blood vessels, that's compartment, and then everything that's not in the blood but it's outside of the cell is called the interstitial fluid. And that's also a solution. So the interstitial fluid would be out here technically. And then if there's fluid outside the cell that's in a blood vessel, that would be the second component of the ECF. So the interstitial fluid is outside of the cell, but not in a blood vessel. The interstitial fluid contains gases, just like the intracellular fluid does. Nutrients, salts, just like the intracellular fluid does. But the interstitial fluid also contains like waste products, hormones, neurotransmitters, all dissolved in water because it's the interstitial fluid and it's a solution. The intracellular fluid is a solution. So everything that's in these compartments are dissolved in water. So here's everything we've been talking about, kind of put together. The phospholipid arrangement of the plasma membrane, or PM. We've talked about this. The polar heads love water, so they're called hydrophilic, so from the Greek philos, to love. And the polar heads are on the inner and outer surfaces, or the inner and outer surfaces of the leaflets of the plasma membrane. And then the hydrophobic, so phobic means you're afraid of it, hydrophobic or water-hating non-polar tails form the interior of the plasma membrane. And we talked about this, the plasma membrane is impermeable to water-soluble molecules. All right, how are cells held together? So this cartoon shows plasma membrane junction. So here's one whole cell. Here's another whole cell. It's kind of cut off, and then to hold these two cells together, you have all these different structures. And then, so let's take a look at them. To hold, this would be the plasma membrane of another cell that you don't see the cell, you just see the plasma membrane. So that can show you these things called tight junctions. So these tight junctions are like these string of purple molecules. They hold cells together. They allow the cells, when they're hooked together, to be impermeable to things. The next plasma membrane junction is called a desmosome. It's an anchoring junction, so it looks like this. Some books call it a spot weld, so if you're a welder and that helps you, that's good. But it's just these areas between two cells that where the plasma membranes are anchored. And then you have these gap junctions. These are not they're not structures that hold the cells together, although it looks like they do. Like they are holding these two cells together, but they're actually for communication. They're not structural to hold the cells together. So they're gap junctions. They're formed by connexons, the little molecules here called connexons, and they allow communication between cells. So ions can flow from one cell to another cell, and that's one way that cells can communicate with each other. So tight junctions, they bind the cells together to make a leak-proof sheet. So like for example, in your intestines, you have these tight junctions so that things don't leak in and out of your intestines. Desmosomes, we talked about those. They anchor cells together and they help to distribute the tension through a cell sheet. And desmosomes reduce the tearing of the cell sheet if they're subjected to mechanical stress. Okay, now let's look at the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is outside of the nucleus, so here's the purple thing. Cytoplasm is outside of the nucleus, but inside the plasma membrane. And there's three major elements in the cytoplasm. You have the cytosol, that's the fluid that suspends the molecules. And remember, the cytosol is a solution. Also within the cytoplasm are organelles that do metabolism. And then you have these other structures called inclusions. They're just chemical substances like stored nutrients. So for example, glycogen that stores glucose. Many of the organelles in eukaryotic cells have membranes around them. and that's critical for that organelle to perform the specialized function. So for example, the nucleus is membrane bound. So that means plasma membrane bound. And, oh, that looks like the end, but let's go over this real quick. So we talked about the nucleus, and we'll talk later in future videos on the cell about how the nucleus is made up of this thing called a nuclear envelope with these little structures in them that allow things to get in and out of the nucleus. And the chromatin, that's the unwound DNA. This nucleolus, we'll talk about that later. We said all this blue stuff is the endoplasmic reticulum. And if it has these little orange balls on it, it's rough endoplasmic reticulum. If you are endoplasmic reticulum and you do not have these rough orange balls on you called ribosomes, then you're smooth ER. And then all of this is cytoplasm, or cytosol, excuse me. Here's a lysosome that contains an enzyme called lysozyme that kills bacteria. Here's our mitochondria. Here's some centrioles used in cell division, microtubules, which are part of the cytoskeleton, intermediate filaments, part of the cytoskeleton, peroxisomes that help to detoxify things. This green thing is the Golgi, and it looks like it's releasing a vacuole that is secreting some molecule via exocytosis that we'll talk about later. So anyway, that's the end of part 1 of the cell.